I just finished a big study of Caribbean coral reefs, and Terry asked me to talk about fisheries, so I'm going to do that, but I'm doing it very much in the context of trying to put together a perspective of the history of the last 45 years in the Caribbean, which is what you all are scrambling to do in trying to think of the threats to the Great Barrier Reef today and sort of how you got to be where you are. And so I'm just coming off of a 3-year effort to try and understand how we got to the mess we're in the Caribbean and what we might do about it. I thought I'd start this way. We use a phrase, the coral reef crisis. And those discussions and the journalism and everything related to it is utterly dominated these days by talk of climate change. And that bias, that intellectual bias, is reflected in the ways we fund science in the relation to coral reefs, at the expense of all the other stuff, which used to be what we worried about on coral reefs and should still worry about today if we weren't sort of hornswoggled by climate change. But the fact of the matter is, if you look closely around the world, there are a whole lot of places, not a little isolated here or there, but a whole lot of places where coral reefs are protected from fishing and pollution, and clearly haven't read the traditional script of climate change because they're in incredibly good shape, with more than 50% living coral and abundant fish. And if you go scuba diving on those places today, they just look absolutely fantastic. It's the way it used to be when, for example, I went to Truk in 1968 and didn't make a single dive, without seeing lots and lots of sharks and lots of big fish everywhere I went. So this is just sort of a start of thinking about this study we did in the Caribbean, and I don't know how aware you are of it, but the Caribbean being closest to Europe and closest to the universities in the United States began to be studied from the point of view of coral reef science in the 19th century. And so there's a long and rich tradition. And so therefore, doing some kind of historical analysis of the way the Caribbean changed is a worthwhile endeavor because there's a lot of data. That's the cover of the report. The upper right is a map showing the location of 90 reef areas that we were able to get data from. And the table shows that there's just tons and tons of data from these 90 places, including 35,000 quantitative surveys, not samples, surveys of Caribbean coral reefs since 1970. And the great majority of that data had never been published because it was languishing in government reports, which, as far as I'm concerned, should be a crime, since we all pay for those data. And you can really sum up what happened in the Caribbean very, very simply. In the early 1970s, there was about 35% coral cover, and there was less than 10% seaweed on the reef, macroalgae. Nowadays, there's about 15 or 14% coral cover, and there's about 25% seaweed. This is the phase shift that Terry first described in his 1994 paper about the coral reefs of Jamaica. And there are a whole lot of people who weren't alive then or had never been on a reef then, who are still publishing papers in peer-reviewed journals saying that it's a sort of a figment of geriatric imagination. There always was a lot of seaweed, and it's this sort of classic shifting baselines problem, because as you can see in this graph, there wasn't always a lot of seaweed. And there's a wonderful quote by Sylvia Earle, who is that person, who lived in Tektite and has been a kind of popular figure in U.S. oceanography for a long time. And she is a classical phycologist. And in her report, based on the Tektite dive, she has a beginning quote, which is to remark upon the fact that the most unusual and striking thing about plants on coral reefs is that there aren't any fleshy algae. They were that rare. In spite of this overall general trend of decline, which is about as bad as, I guess, the inner southern Great Barrier Reef. There's enormous variation in the fates of places. Some places, like on the left, that orange color, just took a nosedive in the 1980s and early 90s and have never recovered. A few places have just shown a kind of linear decline, going. And then there are the places that didn't read the script. Some of them have a lot of coral, some of them don't have very much coral, but they haven't been changing significantly over the last 40 years. And, that's really interesting, because if we knew what it is about the places that haven't declined, then we could put that in our toolkit to actually achieve something in the context of, say, Hugh's talk yesterday about how we might actually make a difference for the future of the badly damaged reefs. And the figure in the lower right is just to emphasize that there is no correlation whatsoever between the fate of the reefs, those different fates of the reefs, and oceanography in the Caribbean. This is not an oceanographic signal. This is a human disturbance signal. So all of that, and I could go on and on, it's a 300-page book, raises, I think, two pretty fundamental questions about conservation and management. Why did the coral decline? For every coral reef scientist, there's a different opinion about that. But we've got so much data that we might actually begin to have an answer to that question. And then the second thing is, why is there the big difference? Why are there some places that seem to have avoided this grim ratchet of progressive decline? And so we spent a huge amount of time looking at 4 different kinds of drivers. The first is just, the great mystery in Caribbean reef ecology is what happened in the 1970s when white band disease just struck. It came from Mars, as far as ecologists were concerned. We had no idea why it was there. And it eliminated the 2 species that were ecologically eliminated, the 2 species that were the major rock builders of Caribbean reefs for 2 million years, Acropora palmata and Acropora cervicornis. And that's if you think of the Pacific, there's no one super abundant creature, a coral, that has been reduced, by 99% of its abundance. And then there's this other thing, black band disease, and these appeared really early, and the only reasonable hypothesis is they came in ballast water, but we don't know. And then the human population explosion and megatourism. Think about it this way. There are nice places with a few hundred tourists per square kilometer per year, but in St. Thomas, there are 25,000 tourists per square kilometer per year. And you can go, swim for a long time before you see a coral or a fish. And then coastal pollution, but, it's just amazing. There are no data to speak of. And you don't collect data, then there isn't an effective coastal pollution, right? It's a very convenient thing. And then there's the loss of grazers, and that's what I'm going to talk about, because this is supposed to be about fishing today. And that's really just a question, because we don't have the ecological, surgeonfish are not that important in the Caribbean. It's basically all about parrotfish, and it's all about the sea urchin diadema that got sick and died in 1983. Okay, so in terms of overfishing, we looked at 3 different kinds of things. We looked at the abundance of coral in terms of cover in relation to parrotfish and sea urchins. And then the ton of experimental evidence that there is about mechanism, what would be the actual mechanistic connection between the removal of fish and the abundance of corals through what macroalgae do. And then the differences in the fates of overfished versus less fished reefs in terms of coral bleaching and disease. So things really went south, right? I mean, this is a graph from a paper that Terry and a bunch of us wrote about reef resilience. The diadema really bit the dust. There are a few places where they're coming back in some abundance, but the important thing are the blue points, which are 0. The average density of diadema in the Caribbean is still basically 0 per square meter. And look at the parrotfish. That's about a paperclip of biomass of parrotfish per square meter. I mean, it's just, you see that one place on the right with 70 to 80 grams of parrotfish per square meter, and the original number from sort of qualitative descriptions had to be around 200, but the average is 5% of that, or less than 5% of it. So essentially, an ecologically defunct guild of fishes. And for recent data, and considering the fact that these data were collected, by something like 100 investigators in zillions of different ways, and we could spend half an hour talking about why it's preposterous to even try to tell a story about data collected in so many ways, there is still this strikingly clear positive relationship between coral cover and parrotfish biomass, and a negative relationship, although it's not statistically significant in the upper right graph, between macroalgal cover and parrotfish, all of which is to say that, if you have a lot of goats in the field, you won't have a lot of plants growing on it, and this is really a difficult concept for ecologists to understand. We were also able to do, and this was really fun, we were able to retrospectively look at overfishing. And we were able to do that because before the diadema died, the abundance of the sea urchin and the abundance of the parrotfish were negatively correlated with each other. They actively competed for food. Algae were a limiting resource, believe it or not, on Caribbean coral reefs, because there was such a great abundance of grazers, mostly the diadema, that they were sort of elbowing each other for food. And we know that from a variety of kinds of evidence. Removal experiments where Marquet removed diadema in a bunch of places and parrotfish abundance tripled. Then the diadema died and parrotfish abundance increased very greatly, et cetera, et cetera. And we had 16 locations where we had really good historical data going back into the 1970s for fishes and for corals. And for those 16 places, we also had diadema abundance. That's what I meant to say, diadema abundance. And they fell into these two very clear categories. Mostly mainland reefs were not yet overfished. They had low densities of the sea urchin. And mostly island reefs that had been very heavily overfished, as Hay showed in his beautiful 1984 paper, had much higher densities of the sea urchin. So we use the abundance of the sea urchin as a sort of a rough proxy for the extent of overfishing that existed back in the 1970s, which there's no data for directly. The first fish abundance data in the Caribbean based on biomass are in 1989. I think it's as bad in Australia. Maybe I'm wrong about that. So this is a messy graph, but it's still really interesting. If you look at coral cover versus the abundance of the sea urchin before it died in that epidemic disease in 1983, and you say, what is the relationship between coral cover and the abundance of the sea urchin? Before the sea urchin died, there was no relationship, no correlation whatsoever. But as soon as the sea urchin died, then all the places that had been overfished had no grazers, and the places that hadn't been overfished did. And so you clearly see this negative relationship between the abundance of the coral and the abundance of the sea urchins before the epidemic. And that relationship persists to the present, which I find really amazing. There's a kind of legacy of overfishing which has persisted for 25 or 30 years. Okay, and then this is the most amazing and the most controversial result, and it's really important in terms of thinking about this contrast between local drivers and global ones, because there is no signal of an impact of global warming in the Caribbean. There's lots of examples of corals dying from extreme heating events, and bleaching, and then disease setting in, and corals dying. But what you're looking at here, I want to really emphasize, is there's a big event, 2005, the famous bleaching event in the Caribbean. You look at coral cover beforehand, the 2 years before, you look at it afterwards, you look at the difference, divide it by the way it was, and you have a proportional change in abundance. And then you look at the relationship between that proportional change in abundance after this really bad heating event in relation to the number of degree heating weeks that were experienced at each of the locations for which you have data. So dogma says you should have a strong negative correlation, right? Extreme heating events are really bad for corals. There should be less coral in the places that had really high number of degree heating events. And the answer is there is no relationship. No statistically significant relationship at all. A is for all the data combined from 1998, 2005, and 2010. B is 1998, C 2005, and D 2010. And look at, let's see if I can do this. Look at this point. Okay, that's Bonaire. That's a place that had 13 degree heating weeks, the most extreme heating in the 2010 event, and coral cover increased after that extreme heating event by 69%. Those are Bob Stenick data. Those are pretty good data. Okay, and so then you come to the point where you say, well, what's going on? I mean, there were a lot of places that are negative, right? I mean, in all those graphs, but there's not, and there's more data to the left because most places didn't have huge numbers of degree heating weeks, so naturally variance is a function of the mean. But you know, there are places that had no degree heating weeks that had huge losses in coral cover, and there are places that had increases in coral cover, but that's also true for places that were really fried. Some of them had huge losses in coral cover, and some of them had huge increases in coral cover. What that scatter is telling you is that warming is a second order factor in trying to understand what's driving change on these reefs. And the key, I believe, goes back to that phase shift and the abundance of macroalgae. So if you ask, how does the abundance of macroalgae on Caribbean reefs, and this is all data from the Caribbean, how does it affect corals? Recruitment rates are much lower in places with high macroalgal cover. There's an active preference for coral and algae, we've known that forever, and an active avoidance of larvae of macroalgae. In settlement experiments that were done in Curacao before the diadema died and afterwards, there's a 20-fold reduction in recruitment after the diadema died because of the macroalgae. And in the few places where, like Pete Mumby's work, where parrotfish are recovering in protected areas, coral recruitment rates are going way up. And the same in Jamaica, actually, where diadema are coming back. And then we also know that macroalgae are really bad for coral health. There's about a dozen experiments now that have been published by about half a dozen different workers showing that, you know, when you put a coral in an experiment next to a lot of macroalgae, they very often get sick and die. That there are chemicals released by the algae that are really bad for the corals. And you know, the dogma is that you have extreme heating, the corals bleach, they're weakened by the event of bleaching, they get infected by whatever makes them sick, and they die. But, you know, there's an alternative hypothesis. The corals bleach or they don't bleach, but there's a ton of seaweed right there, and seaweed are really bad for corals, so they get sick and die. And there's more experimental evidence for that second hypothesis than the first. Okay, and then, you know, the data are shockingly bad. I actually spent about 2 hours last night going through the data sets just looking for it. But so The model of horrific reefs in the Caribbean is the United States Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and the Florida Keys. The model for really good reefs in the Caribbean is Bermuda, the Flower Garden Banks, Bonaire, and to a lesser extent, the Cayman Islands. So this is incredibly small sample size. I wouldn't even think of doing statistics on it. The numbers of just locations are very small, 8 and 6. Average degree heating weeks between the two groups is just a little higher in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, but not that much. The average change in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico is minus 45%. The average change in Bermuda Bonaire is plus 19%. They're increasing in coral cover. Parrotfish is double in abundance in the places that are going well, and coral cover is almost 4 times greater. Okay, now this is not a unique observation. A long time ago at one of the Australian coral reef meetings, I had just come back from the Line Islands and talked about this. A whole bunch of us went to the Line Islands. We went to 4 of the islands that were a gradient in human population density. In the Line Islands, you fish and you eat canned fish and you eat canned beans, and the only agriculture is you pick a few coconuts and there's no fertilizer, and the only nutrient pollution is human poop, which is not a whole lot, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So it's essentially fishing pressure as a function of numbers of people, and where there are no people, the reefs are beautiful, not only with abundant fish, but beautiful coral and algae, and in places with relatively more people, it's exactly the reverse. And the only thing that's different among those islands is the fishing pressure. And, so I showed you pictures that showed everything, but there's a clear decrease in fish biomass. There's a clear decrease in the abundance of corals and crustose coral and algae, and explosions, huge forest rowers work on increases in bacteria, viruses, and pathogens. And there's a very strange thing about this that I frankly don't think anybody understands. The pitch about this is that it's a trophic cascade, because if you look at the herbivorous fish abundance, there's no difference across that gradient. And I just think we don't know what the important grazers are. But whatever it is, fishing is clearly the driver of this difference. And these reefs are more resilient, the ones that aren't heavily fished or fish at all, because coral recruitment decreases with fishing pressure and incidence of disease increases with fishing pressure. And again, I emphasize the only difference among these places is fishing pressure. And then my wife was, Nancy was in the Southern Line Islands on an amazing cruise I was jealous of. And they went to pretty much all of the islands in the Southern Line Island chain. This is a typical photograph. No place that they went had less than 50% live coral cover. Every place they went had abundant fishes. And these places have, and this has not been properly studied, but we know from looking at satellite data that these places have experienced extreme heating events, but they didn't read the book, so they didn't die. Okay, so there's, in the Caribbean, but I really enjoyed yesterday morning, there's obviously a need to do what Hugh said, and that's to get on to prioritizing rather than whinging. And to think about specific achievable objectives. In the Caribbean, climate change has been used as an excuse to do nothing. If the goddamn gringos burned all that oil and they put all that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and they're standing up there and they're telling me that my coral reefs are hopeless, why should I tell my brother he can't fish? And you see that over and over and over again. But the extreme variability in condition of reefs says we could actually make a difference. We could do some very straightforward things that would have a huge effect. And we ought to focus on those instead of, just crying about climate change. If you think about it, doctors don't teach medical students to write better and better obituaries. They teach them how to try and save people's lives. And what we need to do is try to save the lives of coral reefs. We could ban fish traps. We could stop all fishing of herbivores, stop all spearfishing. There's no money in this. I mean, it's the tail wagging the dog. All the money in that region is tourism and agriculture. It sure as hell is not fishing. Improve coastal zone management. Look at pictures on the web of Cozumel with wall-to-wall hotels built on patch reefs offshore. And reduce coastal pollution. My country is the worst. You're ashamed, I'm ashamed. The healthiest reefs in the region are in the flower garden banks in the northern Gulf of Mexico, which if you look from the air is surrounded by oil rigs, but you know, it's not very pretty, and nobody's figured out how to build a hotel off the flower garden reefs. If they did, they'd be gone. But you know, all the other US reefs are among the most extremely degraded, and the Florida Keys and the US Virgin Islands are an eco-catastrophe. 4%, 5% live coral cover. It's like the inner southern Great Barrier Reef. There is a huge problem, this is my last slide, on what I call faith-based conservation, actually, when I'm in a bad mood, pseudoscience. You know, so when we had this report, there's something called the ICRI, which sponsored this, the International Coral Reef Initiative, and they have an annual meeting, and it's really fun because there are all these people come from all these different countries. And so I presented the report, and they voted, in response to the report, they voted unanimously to go back to their governments and say we should ban fish traps and we should stop the spearing of parrotfish. But you know, I'm getting beaten up by, I won't name names, by a group of people who say this report is trash because it does not say that the primary cause of the decline of Caribbean coral reefs is climate change. And the amusing thing about this is that our data about climate change are the NOAA, Pathfinder satellite, Coral Reef Watch data prepared for us for those sites by the people who work in that place. And when we got a result that said there wasn't a relationship, they said there was something wrong. But they're the one who gave me the data. So, I mean, we have this kind of ideological fixation, and what we do is conservation. And it really is setting us back because not only is it slowing us down, but it's also giving food and energy to the dark side, man. Because if you're going around saying it's all this or it's all that, and you give room for doubt, you can be damn sure they'll stick a wedge in and get you. Thank you very much.